In the official history of science fiction cinema, innovation is often presented as something clean, traceable, and celebrated. Studios highlight the breakthroughs they funded, directors promote the techniques they refined, and award shows immortalize the names attached to every first. But behind that polished narrative lies another story, one made of forgotten experiments, misplaced credit, and ideas that quietly changed the industry long before anyone with power acknowledged them. Across the last 5 decades, scattered throughout low-budget productions and obscure releases, a group of filmmakers pushed beyond the limits of their era. They created camera rigs from hardware stores, stitched visual effects by hand, blended analog and digital processes in ways no studio had ever attempted, and shaped concepts that would later define entire genres. Their films did not always succeed. Some vanished from theaters in days, others were buried by poor marketing, and many simply arrived before audiences knew what to make of them. As their work faded from view, their innovations faded with it. Years later, Hollywood reintroduced these same techniques, polished, branded, and presented as newly invented. Production houses spoke of breakthroughs that had, in truth, existed for years. Visual effects supervisors described processes that independent filmmakers had once developed out of necessity. And when journalists asked where the ideas came from, the answers were vague or strangely confident. We created it. Tonight's episode reopens that hidden archive. We're not looking at the biggest blockbusters or the most celebrated names. We're examining the films that cracked the code. First, the ones whose impact was never acknowledged, whose contributions were quietly repurposed, and whose creators watched their innovations reappear in far larger productions. This is a record of the techniques that were borrowed, rebranded, or erased. This is the story of the pioneers who never received their titles. These are the uncredited innovators. 1. Dark City 1998. Dark City is often celebrated for its atmospheric brilliance, but its most influential innovation emerged from a visual trick intended to depict reality itself bending to unseen forces. The filmmakers developed a practical digital hybrid technique to represent the city's nightly transformations, buildings stretching, streets reconfiguring, and entire districts shifting as if guided by a hidden architectural will. Instead of relying solely on CGI, then expensive and unreliable, the team blended miniature model morphing, controlled mechanical deformation, optical transitions, and selective digital interpolation. The result was a seamless, reality shift morphing effect that felt tactile yet impossible, grounded yet dreamlike. This visual language would later become a staple of blockbuster cinema. Major studios introduced their own interpretations of reality warping sequences, cities folding, structures twisting, parallel worlds merging, and promoted them as groundbreaking. But frame-by-frame analysis reveals striking similarities to Dark City's handcrafted experiments. Even the cadence of transformation, the pulsing inhale before structures reshape, the flickering shadows signaling instability mirrors techniques the earlier film pioneered. Hollywood's rebranding of these ideas was eased by Dark City's limited commercial reach. Though critically admired, the film's cult status prevented its visual innovations from entering mainstream technical discourse. Production documents describing the hybrid deformation pipeline were never widely circulated, and some were reportedly lost during studio reorganizations. As later films dazzled audiences with their monumental reality warps, few recognized the fingerprints of a smaller, stranger predecessor. For the visual effects artists who worked on Dark City, the echoes were unmistakable. Many described watching blockbuster distortions that felt like refined versions of their own experiments scaled up, digitized, and stripped of context. The industry had effectively reimagined their innovation under a different name. Today, the film stands as a quiet foundation beneath modern sci-fi's most spectacular illusions, the unacknowledged architect of worlds that reshape themselves in the dark. 2 Screamers 1995. On the surface, Screamers appears to be a gritty, practical sci-fi thriller, but behind its cold landscapes lies a groundbreaking effects technique designed to visualize an invisible threat. To depict the subterranean movement of the self-replicating weapons known as Screamers, the filmmakers created an analog terrain-matching compositing system. This involved combining miniature ground plates with motion-tracked vibration passes and layered particulate displacement, giving the impression that something was tunneling beneath the earth with alarming speed and precision. The effect was subtle but transformative. Rather than relying on creature shots, the film communicated danger through environmental reaction, a method that later became standard in big-budget blockbusters portraying hidden or burrowing threats. When studios eventually introduced digital terrain warp algorithms, these were celebrated as fresh innovations, yet the underlying logic, the ground shifting in concentric pulses, surface debris scattering in patterned bursts, the environment behaving like a living sensor was already present in Screamers. Built with analog patience rather than digital power, the film's modest scale and lukewarm reception meant its innovations attracted little attention. Trade publications at the time barely mentioned the compositing process, and the production's internal effects breakdowns were reportedly misplaced in subsequent rights transfers. Some technicians who worked on the movie later noticed uncanny similarities in later high-profile scenes, recognizing visual signatures they had carefully crafted under less forgiving conditions. As Hollywood embraced digital solutions, the analog method vanished from documentation, as though the concept had never existed before the new tools arrived. But the DNA of Screamer's terrain-matching logic lingers in modern sci-fi. The invisible force hinted through shifting ground, the vibration patterns that betray unseen movement, the environmental storytelling that reveals a threat without showing it. Screamers may not have been a major success, but it quietly shaped how films portray dangers lurking beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, without ever receiving the credit it deserved. 3 Strange Days, 1995. Strange Days might be best known for its grim paranoia and kinetic tension, but its true legacy lies in a technical breakthrough that reshaped how Hollywood imagined first-person cinema. To portray the squid recordings experiences captured directly from another person's senses, the filmmakers designed an unprecedented point-of-view rig built from lightweight camera housings, custom fisheye lenses, and a modular harness that allowed operators to move with uncanny fluidity. Instead of simply showing what a character saw, the system replicated the sensation of inhabiting their body with subtle head tilts, weight shifts, and peripheral distortions that felt startlingly real for the mid-1990 seconds. These sequences required operators to navigate complex environments in extended, unbroken takes, actions believed nearly impossible at the time. Achieving them demanded precise choreography, specialized optical mapping, and custom-built stabilization components. Years later, when studios revealed their own revolutionary point-of-view rigs for immersive action sequences, the resemblance to Strange Days was unmistakable. Many praised these new rigs as technological leaps, unaware that Catherine Bigelow's team had solved similar challenges a decade earlier with little more than experimentation and determination. The film's poor box office performance made it easy for Hollywood to overlook its innovations. Reviews focused on its intensity and thematic boldness, rarely acknowledging the technical audacity behind the camera work. Internal production sketches and engineering notes were archived inconsistently, and several crew members later remarked that early prototypes of the rig were missing when they attempted to reference them for future projects. What endured was the visual language, not the credit. Modern point of view-driven films, especially those simulating altered consciousness or enhanced perception, echo Strange Days so strongly that the original scenes feel predictive rather than dated. As immersive cinematography becomes a dominant style, the film stands as the unrecognized precursor, the blueprint hidden beneath the techniques others would later claim as their own. 4. Split Second, 1992. Split Second is often remembered for its grimy neo-noir atmosphere, but beneath its rain-soaked streets lies a technical achievement that reshaped how filmmakers approached environmental lighting. The team engineered a hybrid rain diffusion system, combining high-pressure water rigs with reflective neon surfaces and controlled particulate haze. Unlike typical rain effects, which merely added texture, this method transformed moisture into an active visual medium. Droplets refracted neon light into veils of shifting color, creating an immersive palette later associated with big-budget dystopian worlds. This approach foreshadowed the resurgence of neon noir aesthetics decades later. When Hollywood revisited rain-drenched futurism, many praised these visuals as groundbreaking reinventions, yet scene compositions rain scattering into chromatic halos, silhouettes dissolving into luminous fog, saturated reflections bending across wet pavement mirror the analog experiments perfected in Split Second. Technicians familiar with the film remarked that modern productions achieved the same effects through digital-grade layering, whereas Split Second created them physically, shot in camera with painstaking precision. The film's modest success and genre-blending identity contributed to its erasure from the innovation record. Its lighting philosophy was never documented in trade journals, and few outside the production realized how complex the diffusion setup truly was. Reports from former crew members indicate that design schematics for the water and light interaction rigs were lost during warehouse closures, leaving behind only anecdotal recollections of the method. As neon-drenched dystopias re-entered cinematic fashion, the industry celebrated their luminous rainscapes while neglecting the analog origin that shaped them. Split Second stands as an early, uncredited architect of a visual style now widely associated with prestige sci-fi. Its atmosphere was not an accident of low-budget aesthetics, but a deliberate, innovative experiment absorbed by the very system that would later forget where the idea began. 5. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995. Long before digital hallucinations and data stream corridors became standard motifs in sci-fi blockbusters, Johnny Mnemonic constructed them through a mixture of analog innovation and experimental visual coding. The crew developed a technique for representing cyberspace not with fully rendered CGI, but with layered matte sequences animated through oscillating distortion fields. These fields were created using refractive plates, noise-driven waveforms, and synchronized light arrays, generating the impression of data rippling around the protagonist in a proto-digital storm. Though imperfect, this method produced an aesthetic that later films would adapt, refine, and eventually claim as their own. The most notable lineage is the data tunnel effect, popularized in high-profile cyber thrillers of the late 1990 seconds. While studios credited sophisticated digital algorithms, the foundational concept, a stylized corridor of shifting information collapsing around a moving subject, appeared years earlier in Johnny Mnemonic. Certain sequences share such structural similarity that technicians who worked on the original film reported recognizing movement patterns and distortion rhythms they had once programmed manually. However, the movie's reception made it easy for the industry to overlook its contributions. Its chaotic tone, uneven editing, and unusual performance choices overshadowed its technical ambition. Promotional material emphasized star power rather than the experimental effects, and some studios dismissed the visuals as quirky rather than pioneering. When digital techniques matured, Hollywood adopted the data corridor concept without revisiting its analog origins. Complicating matters further, internal documentation describing the effect pipeline was reportedly lost during post-production. Restructuring. Without these notes, the method became fragmented history, a collection of faint technical memories rather than a recorded innovation. Today, Johnny Mnemonic sits in a strange transitional zone, a film mocked upon release, yet quietly foundational in shaping the visual lexicon of cyberspace. Its innovations linger as shadows, reappearing in films that received the credit it never did. 6. Nemesis, 1992. Among the gritty cyberpunk films of the early 1990 seconds, Nemesis stands out not only for its frenetic energy, but for a technical breakthrough that quietly reshaped how action cinema captured bodily momentum. Working with a modest budget, the filmmakers developed a body-mounted kinetic cam rig, an assemblage of lightweight brackets, stabilizers, and counterweights strapped to the actors to produce an unsettling hybrid perspective. The camera appeared to hover just outside the performer's movement, as if tethered to their musculature rather than the environment. This produced a visceral, almost cybernetic sense of acceleration that perfectly matched the film's biomechanical themes. What is striking is how closely later Hollywood productions echoed this visual language. In the 2000s and 2010 seconds, several studios unveiled their own body-mounted camera systems, praising them as revolutionary tools for immersing audiences in frantic action. Promotional materials describe them as the first rigs capable of maintaining coherent framing during high-impact sequences, yet the rhythms, angles, and kinetic distortions they generated were nearly identical to the analog setup used in Nemesis. The resemblance was so precise that some cinematographers familiar with the earlier film openly questioned whether the innovation was truly new. Because Nemesis existed outside mainstream visibility, its contributions were never formally recognized. The film's rough aesthetic and direct-to-video reputation obscured the sophistication of its camera design. Even internal notes documenting the construction of the kinetic cam reportedly went missing during rights transfers, leaving the method preserved only in the footage itself. The operators who built the rig spoke of watching modern productions replicate its results with far cleaner hardware, producing a kind of professional déjà vu, the industry praising an idea they had tested under far less forgiving circumstances. In retrospect, the kinetic cam stands as an early embodiment of the cyberpunk ethos technology, fused with flesh, form shaped by motion. It anticipated the dynamic, actor-centered cinematography now standard in action and sci-fi films. Yet its origin remains buried beneath the film's cult identity. 7 Saturn III 1980. Saturn III was widely dismissed for its uneven tone and unconventional casting, but buried inside its troubled production was a robotics experiment far ahead of its time. The film's antagonist, Hector, was not a simple suit performer nor a basic puppet. It was a multi-operator practical machine designed with joint articulation patterns modeled on biomechanical studies. The robotics team developed a synchronized control system in which separate operators managed torso rotation, limb movement, and micro-gestures, creating a fluidity that seemed unnervingly organic. The illusion anticipated later advancements in animatronics and servo-driven robotics, yet Saturn III rarely appears in the official lineage of such developments. Hollywood would later showcase sophisticated robot characters built with similar multi-operator logic, now assisted by digital cleanup and motion stabilization tools. These newer creations were widely praised as unprecedented achievements. Meanwhile, the robotics team from Saturn III recalled watching sequences in major productions that replicated movement patterns they had spent months refining. Under harsh studio conditions, the resemblance was particularly strong in the controlled hesitations, those slight mechanical pauses that hinted at artificial cognition. Complicating matters further, production disputes reportedly led to the loss of engineering documents detailing Hector's internal control systems. Technicians who attempted to revisit the design years later noted that key diagrams and servo mapping sheets had vanished. Without these records, the film's robotics legacy became difficult to trace, making it easy for studios to overlook or overwrite its contributions. Though rarely acknowledged, Saturn III served as a strange precursor to modern robotic performance methodology. It demonstrated that complex artificial characters could be achieved with coordinated analog control. Long before digital augmentation made the process fashionable, its innovations survived not through formal recognition, but through echoes in machines built by those who may never have realized they were inheriting a forgotten design. 8. Brainstorm, 1983. At the center of Brainstorm lies a technological fantasy, a device capable of recording and replaying human experience. What makes the film remarkable is not just the concept, but the radical visual strategy used to depict sensory transfer. Director Douglas Trumbull engineered a custom point-of-view system built from modular camera rigs, mirrored housings, and experimental lens arrays designed to replicate the sensation of occupying another person's perception. When the experience recordings played back, the shift in visual grammar, wider fields of view, distorted depth, heightened clarity created an immersive effect that predated modern VR-oriented cinematography by decades. Trumbull's team further experimented with variable frame rates and hybrid projection formats, devising transitions in which the camera seemed to enter the consciousness of a character rather than simply follow them. Many of these ideas resurfaced later in high-profile blockbusters and VR-based cinematic showcases, where studios celebrated their own revolutionary point-of-view innovations. Yet the language they used, total field immersion, enhanced perspective mapping, perceptual framing, mirrored the internal terminology developed for Brainstorm. The connection went largely unmentioned outside specialist circles. Compounding this erasure was the film's troubled production and muted reception, overshadowed by the death of Natalie Wood. The project's experimental visual work became a footnote rather than a milestone. Archival materials reveal that several companies studied Brainstorm's optical rigs when developing next-generation point-of-view systems, though few cited their source. Trumbull himself later suggested that the industry was more comfortable adopting his ideas than publicly acknowledging them. Today, as immersive cinematography becomes a defining feature of futuristic storytelling, Brainstorm appears less like an outlier and more like a missing chapter, an early blueprint for visual technologies that Hollywood would eventually claim as its own. 9. The Quiet Earth, 1985. The Quiet Earth is best remembered for its haunting solitude, but beneath its minimalist exterior lies a technical idea that would quietly ripple through decades of science fiction imagery: the temporal echo shot. This technique simulated the impression that time itself was slipping, looping, or fracturing years before digital tools made such illusions commonplace. The crew developed the effect using analog means: multiple exposures captured at staggered intervals, combined with precise alignment of slowed motion passes and chemical adjustments during optical printing. The result was a ghostly afterimage of the protagonist, as though the universe had briefly duplicated him, then reconsidered. Though subtle, these echoes became a visual shorthand for temporal instability. Hollywood would later employ similar treatments to represent glitches in time, alternate selves merging, or moments of collapsed causality. But those later attempts were executed with digital compositing, marketed as cutting-edge software-driven innovations. Few acknowledged that the Quiet Earth had crafted these temporal fractures by hand, using techniques so delicate that the filmmakers worried the effect might fail entirely. The film's limited release ensured its innovations lived mostly in word-of-mouth anecdotes among technicians. Some effects artists recalled seeing bootleg reels circulated in labs as reference material, never officially included in training or documentation, yet appearing mysteriously familiar when certain studios unveiled new temporal distortion aesthetics in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The resemblance was unmistakable: the same rhythmic ghosting, the same slight misalignment of layered selves, the same eerie delay between action and reflection. Even stranger, production notes that detailed the timing formulas reportedly vanished during a studio reorganization. Only fragments of interviews remain, where members of the effects team described their analog experiment as a glitch the universe might believe. Today, The Quiet Earth remains a case study in innovation absorbed without acknowledgement, a film that manipulated time before Hollywood decided it was possible. 10. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. Across the Eighth Dimension, 1984. Chaotic, eccentric, and impossible to categorize, Buckaroo Banzai hides a technical lineage more structured than its narrative. Central to its visual identity was the film's interpretation of dimensional transition, a blend of practical optical distortion, layered matte shifts, and controlled camera wobble that simulated the destabilization of space as characters breached the so-called eighth dimension. Effects artists produced these sequences using a hybrid method that combined analog refractive plates with composited energy overlays, an approach that later blockbuster franchises would refine digitally while presenting it as newly conceived. The effect was subtle yet unmistakable: surfaces bending in impossible directions, depth fields momentarily collapsing, and characters flickering as if caught between incompatible physical states. When modern films began exploring multiverse visuals or extra-dimensional rifts, their digital distortions bore striking similarities to Buckaroo Banzai's handcrafted experiments. Some even replicated the rhythm of its dimensional stutter, a pattern created by manually offsetting frames during compositing. Yet the film's cult status worked against its recognition. Audiences appreciated its oddball tone, but few understood the sophistication behind its visual anomalies. Studios showed little interest in attributing later visual trends to a quirky box office disappointment. Internal effects memos from the 1980 seconds, suggesting that Buckaroo Banzai had pioneered dimensional distortion techniques, were rarely referenced again. Years later, as the concept of parallel universes entered mainstream filmmaking, certain effects houses touted their proprietary extra-dimensional render systems. Their demonstrations, however, retained unmistakable echoes of the techniques first tested here. Some artists who worked on Buckaroo Banzai noticed these parallels immediately, describing the sensation as watching a forgotten idea return under a different name. The film stands as a strange, brilliant precursor, a technical milestone wrapped in eccentric storytelling. Its innovations absorbed by an industry that never officially looked back. 11. Android, 1982. At a glance, Android appears to be a modest sci-fi chamber piece, but behind its taut narrative lies a visual philosophy decades ahead of its time. Working with limited resources, The filmmakers constructed an improvised lighting architecture built from neon tubes, reflective panels, and low-frequency gels, elements arranged to create pulses of color that shifted with the emotional state of the android protagonist. The effect resembled what modern filmmakers later branded as synthwave lighting, though Android had implemented these principles long before the aesthetic became a recognizable cultural movement. The crew's unconventional rig allowed the environment to respond dynamically to character movement, giving scenes an eerie, reactive quality. Light didn't merely illuminate, it behaved like a subconscious presence. Contemporary productions would eventually replicate this reactive neon style using digital color grading and programmable LED systems, but in Android, it was achieved entirely through analog experimentation. Notes from set designers describe hand-built sequencers, experimental diffusion materials, and lighting corridors calibrated largely by instinct. Despite its ingenuity, the film's visual innovation went unmentioned in mainstream coverage. The movie underperformed commercially, and its minimalist setting misled many into assuming its look was a budgetary compromise rather than a deliberate, forward-thinking design choice. As synthwave and neon noir aesthetics resurfaced, decades later, praised as bold stylistic reinventions in streaming-era sci-fi, few acknowledged their uncanny resemblance to the analog rhythms explored in Android. Some of the crew have recalled seeing modern productions deploy LED-driven lighting rigs that mirrored the emotional reactivity systems they built by hand. To them, the rediscovery of these concepts felt both familiar and strangely displaced, as if the industry had circled back to a moment it never realized it had passed through before. Today, Android remains a quiet but foundational artifact, a film whose luminous psychology prefigured a visual culture that would flourish long after its creators were forgotten. 12. Starchaser: The Legend of Orin, 1985. Before hybrid animation became a celebrated hallmark of major studios, Starchaser: The Legend of Orin quietly attempted something extraordinary, merging cel-animated characters with early CGI environments in a way that mimicked volumetric depth. The film's digital backdrops were constructed using primitive polygonal modeling, then rendered with lighting approximations far ahead of what most animation houses believed feasible. To blend these backgrounds with hand-drawn characters, the crew developed a timing-based compositing method that aligned SEL movements to the digital geometry, giving the illusion that flat artwork occupied real, three-dimensional space. This approach appears rudimentary today, but its core principles directly anticipate the hybrid pipelines that later defined the animation renaissance of the 1990 seconds and 2000s. The controlled parallax shifts, the depth-mapped lighting, the alignment of character silhouettes to digital surfaces. These techniques appear again in celebrated works from major studios. Though framed as novel breakthroughs rather than echoes of a forgotten experiment, what complicates the historical record is how Starchaser was received. Distributed unevenly, marketed poorly, and overshadowed by larger productions, the film drifted into obscurity almost immediately. Its most ambitious technical work was scarcely mentioned in press materials, and few contemporary animators were aware that such hybridization had ever been attempted at this scale, yet insiders later admitted that test footage from Starchaser circulated quietly within professional circles during the rise of CGI-assisted animation, serving as a reference point while never being named outright. Some members of the original effects team have recalled experiencing a strange mixture of pride and erasure as studios unveiled new methods, nearly identical to their own. Even the film's archival materials render logs, early modeling drafts, compositing notes reportedly went missing, leaving behind only the finished frames as evidence. As the industry narrates its evolution from traditional animation to digital fusion, Starchaser occupies a ghostly position. It was there first, doing what no one claimed was possible, and then simply vanished from the official lineage of innovation. 13. The Last Starfighter, 1984. Long before CGI became synonymous with blockbuster filmmaking, The Last Starfighter attempted something that most studios considered too unstable, too expensive, or too unproven: rendering entire spacecraft sequences digitally. These early computer-generated models were crude by modern standards, but the underlying mathematical principles, the spline-based shaping, the surface interpolation, the digitally plotted camera trajectories were astonishingly advanced for a production of its scale. The team at Digital Productions effectively built a parallel future for visual effects, one in which entire environments could be constructed without physical models. Yet the film's commercial reception and the public's unfamiliarity with digital imagery prevented these advances from being fully recognized. Critics described the visuals as odd, synthetic, or experimental, and studios interpreted the response as proof that audiences weren't ready for full-scale CGI. Ironically, the techniques pioneered here, especially the digital camera movement systems, would later be reintroduced during the rise of CGI-heavy blockbusters, heralded as groundbreaking achievements by companies with far greater resources. The strangest part is how quietly this lineage was obscured. While later productions celebrated their use of digitally rendered spacecraft, promotional material rarely referenced The Last Starfighter as a foundational ancestor. Some visual effects supervisors admitted, off-record, that early digital rendering tests from the 1,980 seconds circulated internally but were seldom discussed publicly, as if acknowledging their existence would complicate the narrative of progress. Meanwhile, several members of the original digital team spoke of an unsettling sense of déjà vu while watching later films, recognizing algorithmic quirks and movement signatures identical to those they had developed decades earlier. Techniques they had written from scratch were now considered proprietary inventions of larger studios. The Last Starfighter remains a paradox, a film whose digital imagination arrived too soon, only to be rediscovered silently, selectively by an industry eager to claim the future it once rejected. 14. Outland 1981. Outland was marketed as a grounded, industrial science fiction thriller. Yet, the film concealed an effects methodology that would quietly shape how Hollywood depicted deep space environments for years. At its core was a miniature compositing pipeline far more intricate than the budget implied. Rather than relying on standard optical printers, the effects team used a hybrid workflow that combined multiple passes of smoke, particulate matter, refracted light, and layered mechanical movement. These layers were then recomposited using a technique resembling early depth-prioritized matting, something rarely attempted outside major studios at the time. The result was a texture that felt unnervingly real. Industrial corridors glowing with particulate haze, cargo modules hovering with mass and weight, and planetary vistas shifting under subtle atmospheric distortion. These were not the grand, operatic visuals of blockbuster sci-fi. They were gritty, functional, and tactile qualities that, decades later, Hollywood would proclaim as a new wave of grounded sci-fi realism. What remains curious is how closely certain high-profile films of the 1,990 seconds and early 2000s mirrored Outland's layered miniature aesthetic, even in moments where the resemblance felt too exact to be coincidence. The soft flares, the particulate depth cues, the industrial silhouettes against drifting atmospheres, techniques widely credited to later productions despite their roots being visible, frame by frame. In Hyams's lesser-known work, the film's modest performance ensured that its innovations stayed in the background. Studio publicity barely mentioned the experimental compositing techniques, and internal documentation reportedly circulated only briefly before the effects unit dissolved. Some technicians who had worked on the film later remarked that they recognized their own methods resurfacing in larger productions, methods they thought had disappeared, along with the film's micro-budget effects department. In retrospect, Outland occupies an unusual place in the lineage of sci-fi visuals, a precursor whose fingerprints appear everywhere except in the official accounts of who invented what. Its legacy persists not in credit, but in a visual language absorbed quietly into the machinery of Hollywood. 15. The Black Hole, 1979. When The Black Hole entered production, Disney was not known for pushing photographic technology into unexplored territory. Yet the crew quietly built one of the most advanced motion control systems of its decade, capable of capturing layered miniature passes with a complexity that rivaled and, in several ways, exceeded what more visible studios were doing at the time. The machine was assembled from repurposed mechanical components, coded routines, and optical alignments that even seasoned technicians considered outside the norm. Its purpose was simple: create a sense of depth inside a space that, by definition, should not follow the ordinary rules of physical perspective. The result was an image language that seemed to fold into itself, Foreground models drifted with an unnatural smoothness, while background starfields bent along curved planes. The camera glided through miniature tunnels with a motion that felt eerily predictive of techniques used 2 decades later in large-scale sci-fi franchises. But while those later productions were celebrated for reinventing motion-controlled photography, The Black Hole received no such recognition. The film's uneven reception, its tonal confusion, and its departure from Disney's established identity ensured that few outside the studio ever looked closely at what had been achieved. Even stranger is what happened afterward. Technical notes documenting the machine's design were archived and later reported missing. Several operators who worked on the system recalled being unable to locate their own drafts when revisiting the studio years later. And when Hollywood touted new multi-axis miniature capture systems in the 1990 seconds, the descriptions read uncannily like refined versions of Disney's abandoned setup minus any acknowledgement of its origins. For those who study visual effects history, The Black Hole stands as an anomaly, a film whose technology appears both foundational and forgotten, as if the industry moved forward by quietly stepping over the traces it left behind. Bonus fact: hardware, 1990. Hardware is often remembered as a cult oddity, grungy, abrasive, stitched together from the scrap metal of late 80s sci-fi, but hidden beneath its dystopian chaos is a technical curiosity that predated a wave of Hollywood experimentation, a method for simulating autonomous machine awareness using nothing more than analog servo loops, selective frame cycling, and reactive lighting. The filmmakers created the illusion that the robot MARK-13 could scan, process, and adapt to its environment in real time. They accomplished this by synchronizing micro-servo jitter with flickering light bands, then blending the motion with subtle jump frame edits so the machine's behavior felt partly mechanical, partly sentient, something between automation and instinct. Years later, blockbusters would introduce their own interpretations of machine consciousness, often through digital eye-tracking algorithms or procedural animation systems. These newer techniques were praised as breakthroughs, yet the underlying language, the searching head tilts, the unpredictable micropauses, the sense of a machine thinking before moving appeared first in hardware through purely analog craft. The robot's behavior was not choreographed in clean digital curves. It was sculpted through imperfections, stutters, and stalled movements that hinted at fragmented cognition. The film's low profile made it easy for the industry to overlook its ingenuity. Its punk aesthetic overshadowed any discussion of technique, and production notes describing the servo-light synchronization reportedly disappeared during a studio move. Still, effects artists from the era have spoken about later seeing nearly identical behavioral patterns in high-budget robots, patterns they once engineered by guesswork in a cramped workshop filled with wires and flickering bulbs. In hindsight, hardware stands as an early attempt to visualize machine intelligence not as smooth efficiency, but as a chaotic, searching presence, an idea Hollywood eventually embraced long after forgetting where it first took shape. Across these forgotten films, a quiet pattern emerges, an echo threading through decades of innovation, techniques born in dimly lit workshops, crafted by hands working without permission or recognition, drifted forward in time until they were claimed by others. Ideas that once belonged to obscure creators reappeared in polished form, attached to different names, different budgets, and different narratives of discovery. Yet the pulse beneath them remained the same, the unmistakable imprint of those who first dared to imagine beyond the frame. What unites these pioneers is not glory or acclaim, but the peculiar weight of obscurity. Their breakthroughs existed in the margins, uncelebrated, unrecorded, sometimes forgotten even by the studios that financed them. And still, the industry grew upon their foundations. Motion that felt impossible, light that behaved like emotion, worlds that reshaped themselves with a breath, machines that seemed to think, all of it carried forward, lineage obscured, as if the future itself had quietly chosen its architects and then erased their signatures. When we revisit these films, we do more than witness primitive experiments. We glimpse the early architecture of cinematic evolution, the scaffolding of modern spectacle hidden in the shadows of smaller stories. The past, it seems, is not a straight line of innovation, but a labyrinth of discoveries lost and rediscovered, each time under a new banner. Perhaps that is the strange gravity of science fiction. Its visions travel faster than the credit they deserve, and somewhere, Tucked between forgotten scripts and misplaced production notes, the true authors of the future wait for their names to be remembered.